In this video clip, we're going to continue our story of damage that is caused by infectious microbes, and we're going to continue our story first with more about bacterial toxins. So in the last video clip, we talked about bacterial exotoxins. So remember, those are proteins that are produced by living bacteria, and they get secreted out of the bacteria, and they get into the body fluids, move into the bloodstream, and can travel throughout the body. And we saw some examples of exotoxins where the actual bacteria are localized in some very small portion of the body, but the effects of those exotoxins can be felt a long distance away. Now, endotoxins are different. These are actually only released from bacteria when those bacteria die, because bacterial endotoxin is a component of the outer membrane layer of gram-negative bacteria. So hopefully this bacterial cell surface or cell envelope chunk looks familiar to you from way back in Chapter 3. Here we have the cell membrane or cytoplasmic membrane. There's the peptidoglycan cell wall, which is thin in gram-negative bacteria. And then here we have the outer membrane modeled for us. And the outer leaflet of the outer membrane, remember the cell membrane is two sheets, so the outer sheet contains molecules known as lipopolysaccharides in gram-negative bacteria. So those are combinations between lipids and polysaccharides, as the name suggests. And these are molecules that exist in bacteria, gram-negative bacteria. The human body does not produce these. The lipid portion is called lipid A. And so again, this is a lipid that is unique to gram-negative bacteria. It is not produced in the human body. So our immune system is actually programmed to respond to lipid A, because when it detects lipid A, that's an indication that there are gram-negative bacteria in the body which are foreign, and so we need to wipe those out. So again, it's the lipid component of these lipopolysaccharides is what is also known as bacterial endotoxin. And it's endo because it's within the bacterial organism. It's actually part of its structure. And so it's actually only going to be released when gram-negative bacteria die and they get digested and broken down by your phagocytes. So your phagocytic cells, one of their jobs is to clean up dead stuff and debris and so forth and break it down. And so when that happens, the lipid A's get released, and that triggers an immune response. Now that's a good thing if you have gram-negative bacteria in a little local area, because it's going to recruit in the immune system, the cells of your immune system that need to swarm in and help fight the infection. But let's say you have a gram-negative septicemia. So septicemia is where you have pathogenic microbes in the blood. If you have gram-negative septicemia, you have these bacteria all throughout your blood, and as phagocytic cells in your blood ingest those gram-negative bacteria and kill them and break them apart, the lipid A molecules get released, and that sets off this tremendous inflammatory response across your whole body all at once. So it's going to be kind of similar to going into anaphylactic shock, like if you were allergic to peanuts or bee venom, things like that. So some of the things that endotoxin can trigger: fever, inflammation, which can be widespread across the body, diarrhea from the intestinal tract, hemorrhaging, shock due to low blood pressure. So again, we've got another scenario here where if you have inflammation occurring all across the body at one time, blood vessels dilate due to inflammation. That's one of the things that's triggered by inflammation, and that can cause your blood pressure to plummet to the point where you go into shock because you're not able to circulate blood to your vital organs. Interestingly, endotoxin can also trigger blood clotting if it's present in high enough concentrations, and that can lead to a condition known as DIC, or disseminated intravascular coagulation. So that's something you'll hear about if you're working with patients in healthcare. And now there's more than one thing that can cause DIC, but endotoxin is one of those things. And what happens in these patients who develop this, they wind up having little minor blood clots that develop throughout their cardiovascular system, and that winds up using up the clotting factors that you learn about when you take Biology 202. And that can actually lead to hemorrhaging. So when you have a real cut a real nick or anything like that. You've used up all your clotting factors, and you're not able to seal off little microscopic wounds in your blood vessels and so forth. So that can lead to hemorrhaging. So if a person has DIC, a patient in the hospital, they're probably going to look really bruised because, every time you bump your arm or leg up against something, you break little tiny blood vessels, and those little tiny blood vessels seal off very quickly due to your clotting factor, so you don't always develop a bruise for every little minor bump. But if you have something like DIC, you're not going to be able to close off those little minor blood vessel nicks, and so you're going to have a lot more. You're going to be a lot more prone to bruising. So that's something that can be very serious due to bacterial endotoxin from gram-negative bacteria. And gram-negative septicemia is a pretty common problem with hospitalized patients. So if for any reason gram-negative bacteria get into the blood, so that could occur through an IV that's been inserted, a central line that's been stuck into one of your subclavian veins up here in the chest. You have to really keep those things very nice and clean and well disinfected, because if gram-negative bacteria get into the bloodstream and begin to multiply, you could wind up having problems with going into shock and experiencing these other symptoms due to the endotoxins. We just mentioned that the endotoxin, that lipid A from gram-negative bacteria, triggers fever. It's one of the things that can trigger fever, and we'll learn more about fever when we get into chapter 12. And how does fever get induced? By the lipid A. All right, so here we've got a macrophage. That's one of those phagocytic cells that you can find in your tissues, and ingests a bacterial cell. This is a gram-negative bacterial cell. And as it gets broken down, endotoxin, or lipid A, is released, and then the macrophage itself will actually detect that lipid A. This is a cell that is programmed to respond to that molecule, and then it's going to secrete proteins called cytokines. These are kind of like the hormones of the immune system, and those cytokines, they're cell signaling molecules. They get into the bloodstream, they travel up here to the brain, and in the brain, in the hypothalamus, you have neurons there that detect these cytokines, and the cytokines tell the neurons to produce molecules called prostaglandins. That's another type of cell signaling molecule that's used locally. And the prostaglandins signal additional neurons in the hypothalamus to trigger the responses that lead to fever development. So maybe when you took Biology 201 or 202, you learned a little bit about the hypothalamus and how it controls body temperature. So you have neurons that exist in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus does lots of things. You'll learn all about it in Biology 202 if you haven't taken that yet. But one of the things that you have some neurons there, one of their jobs is to control the thermostat of the body. So if you're going to develop a fever, what happens to you when you develop a fever? You know how people look pale when they're first getting sick? That's due to vasoconstriction. The body is triggered to constrict blood vessels that are close to the surface of the skin. That helps keep the blood deeper in the body where it's warmer and prevents the loss of body heat. And then what's something else that happens to you when you get cold? You start shivering, correct? And so shivering is due to involuntary skeletal muscle fiber contractions. So those skeletal muscle fibers are having to do a lot of cellular respiration to fuel all that shivering. And a byproduct of catabolism, breaking down nutrients for cellular respiration, is heat generation. So that's why when you're first developing a fever, you may get the chills and you start shivering, shaking. That's your hypothalamus has signaled your skeletal muscles to start shaking like that to generate some heat so that you'll develop a fever. And as we'll learn when we get into chapter 12, a low-grade fever has benefits to helping fight off infections. Of course, a higher fever becomes detrimental to the body if it's allowed to go too high. Another thing you have to be careful with is if a patient has gram-negative septicemia, you have to be careful about giving them antibiotic therapy or antibacterial therapy, because that's going to kill a lot of the gram-negative bacteria, so you're going to have more of this going on, and in some cases it could lead to these more widespread severe effects of that lipid A endotoxin. So sometimes it may be better to just let your immune system try to clear out those gram-negative bacteria on a more gradual basis, rather than trying to kill a whole bunch of them rapidly with an antibacterial drug. But of course there are different procedures and so forth based on the type of infection you have that really dictates how a patient is going to be treated. In some cases they will be given the antibacterial therapy, because if they don't get it, they're going to wind up dying from the infection anyway. All right, so another way that microbial infections can cause damage in the body is simply through inducing host defenses. So sometimes the immune system's reaction is what actually causes the damage and the problems for you. And a really good example is when you develop pneumonia. So Streptococcus pneumoniae, we've talked about this organism before. That is a type of bacteria that has a capsule which helps prevent phagocytosis. This is a pretty common cause of bacterial pneumonia. So these bacteria go down deep into the lungs. They invade these alveolar sacs, the little air sacs in the lungs where gas exchange occurs with the blood, and the bacteria persists there because of their capsules. Your immune system cells have a very difficult time doing phagocytosis on them, and so that winds up causing inflammation to continue and continue and continue and continue, and you have a buildup of inflammatory exudate. So all this mucousy type fluid and so forth, and there's white blood cells mixed in there because they've been recruited in to try to fight off the infection. So that's all that gunk that builds up down deep in your lungs when you have something like pneumonia. And if you have enough of this going on in a significant part of the lungs, or even maybe if you have double pneumonia where both lungs are involved, it can prevent proper gas exchange. You're supposed to be sending O2 into the blood and taking away the carbon dioxide. And if you've got all this inflammatory exudate in here, that's not going to happen efficiently. So that can cause you to die. People die of pneumonia, of course. So inflammation is supposed to be, and we'll learn more about inflammation when we get into chapter 12, but this occurs very rapidly. It's a fast, natural defense to invading microbes and also to injury. And some hallmark symptoms of that: edema, which is the clinical term for it. Do you know what edema stands for? Swelling, redness, pain. You have infiltration of leukocytes or white blood cells. They get recruited in to help fight any infections and clean up the damage. And then you have the generation of this inflammatory exudate. Another example of that would be like pus. If you see pus on a wound. And when you guys learn about inflammation, you learn that during inflammation, local blood vessels dilate, and that lets blood plasma, the liquid portion of the blood, to escape into the surrounding tissues. That's where the edema comes from. The vasodilation is responsible for the redness near the surface because you've got more blood flow toward the surface and the blood looks red. And then pain occurs as well because you've got the buildup of the fluids and damage to the tissues and so forth. And so the sensory neurons that are supplying that area where the inflammation is occurring are going to send signals towards your spinal cord and brain that you'll interpret as pain. Another term to know, necrosis, and we've talked about this before with necrotizing fasciitis. So that's a term that just refers to cell and tissue death, and that's caused, for various reasons. Any kind of damage that's occurring due to microorganisms. That can be through exoenzymes, toxins, and some microbes actually obstruct blood vessels or lymphatic vessels, even the fallopian tubes and bile ducts, depending on where the infection is located. And so you can imagine if the microbes are cutting off the blood supply, that's going to lead to tissue death as well. It's going to lead to necrosis. Good example of necrosis, like with frostbite, and the tissues die and can turn black due to the dead tissue remaining in place. That's an example of necrotic tissues. All right, how about viruses? So we've mostly been talking about bacteria so far as we've gone over damage. Viruses cause damage as well. And if we think back to Chapter 5, we learn that viruses attach to a host cell receptor. They go inside, their genetic material enters the host cell, and that basically reprograms the cell to crank out new viruses. And in many cases, those viruses cause lysis of the host cell. Eventually, the host cell dies and breaks open. So that's one way that viruses can cause damage. And any type of effects, and we talked about cytopathic effects back in Chapter 5, if you remember. Those are effects where the cells either die or become sick due to infection with the virus. Now, when we get into Chapter 13, in that part of the immune system, we're going to learn about how your immune system is actually programmed to torpedo or kill cells in your body that have been invaded by viruses. Because when a virus goes into a host cell, it's really hidden from your immune system. But when we get into Chapter 13, we'll see that you have specialized lymphocytes whose job it is to identify cells in the body that have viruses or other types of microorganisms inside. And what they do is they actually kill those cells. So they're sacrificing those host cells in your body to try to limit spread of the virus or another type of microbe that might be intracellular, might be an intracellular invader. We also have cells called natural killer cells that do that as well. So we'll learn about those when we get into Unit 4. So either of those types of things, though, can cause cell and tissue damage. So it may be directly due to the virus, or it might be due to the immune response, actually killing your own cells and tissues to try to prevent further spread of the virus. All right, so that's going to conclude our section on damage to the body. That's a pretty creepy, interesting part of microbiology. And now if you guys go back to the back of the book, and you'll start to see all these different kinds of infectious diseases classified there by the body systems that they impact. And you guys have built up enough background knowledge now, which is really the goal of the class, to go back there and read about some of these various infectious diseases that exist, things that you might be curious about. And you're going to see that your vocabulary has built up to the point where you can read those sections and really understand what's being discussed there. So when you go in there, they'll talk about antimicrobial treatments, the virulence factors of the microbe and how it causes disease. And so you want to start doing that, going back into the back of the book and reading about some of these infectious diseases that are going to be important for you to know about as you move toward a career in healthcare. All right, so on video lecture 8, we'll still be here on step 4, causing disease, but we're going to talk about a couple of other topics, patterns of infection, and also signs and symptoms. The signs and symptoms, they get grouped together quite a bit, but there's actually a difference in what those two terms mean, and so we'll talk a little bit about that in the 8th video lecture.